Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about the old adage that patience is a virtue. So today's talking back point looks back to when I was a very young lad. My grandparents would often say things like patience is a virtue, haste is a sin, as if my 7 or 8 year old brain could truly appreciate what that actually meant. Of course now I look back and I realise what they were trying to say was think before you do something rash. Don't rush in, consider what you're doing, consider the implications. All very good life tips, but also very good painting and wargaming tips. Now there have been plenty of occasions when haste has resulted in disaster, both on the painting table and on the games table. And I'm well aware that swift action, seizing initiative can be decisive in a wargame, but so can the rash action and not carefully thought through strategies. Now, and that analogy is even truer when painting miniatures. So when it comes to painting, patience and precision go hand in hand, particularly when you're starting out. Now I learned very early on that it was better to take my time, think through what I was about to do, and only then apply paint to a model. Patience is worth the effort because painting isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. Especially when you're painting an army. Techniques like layering, washes, inks, and these days contrast paints all require a bit of patience. Rushing to the next stage can ruin a model very quickly. And that's why I usually have multiple models on the go, so that I can be working on one while the other is drying and then swap over and so on. Now, patience may produce better results when you're painting, but it's also a really useful way to manage your stress. Learning to slow down and take a deep breath is not a bad thing. So much of our day-to-day lives is fast-paced, frantic and frankly anxiety-inducing. Learning to sit back and take a little bit more time, particularly over a craft, will reap benefits, I promise you, not just with your painting. So this week's talking point is pretty short. I thought I would focus on asking for your examples of haste bringing disaster to your table, whether that's your games table or your workbench. Do you have any good, or should I say bad, examples of impatience hastening disaster in your wargaming or painting? As always, I'd really like to hear your examples of success or failure brought about by being rather rash. Of course, if you don't want to admit to your impatience, you could always start by saying, "This happened to a friend of mine." I'll believe you, I promise. It's time for a very quick hobby update. On Monday, 4 of the rejigs gathered together for a remote game hosted by Jonathan Freitag from the US. This time he was running his Lake Treasure game using Basic Impetus, all played over Zoom. Ray and I were the Carthaginians versus Richard and Steve as the hapless Romans under Flaminius. We started the game with the initiative and 2 activation dice, while the Romans would only be able to respond with part of their force and would be disordered automatically if we contacted in first turn. Now this represented the confusion and chaos amongst the Roman line as they were caught in what was the largest ambush in history. Indeed, I've played this game myself using a different set of rules. With their backs to the lake and the head of their line trapped in a narrow defile, they had walked into a terrible position. That being said, they have more heavy troops than their opponents, and many of those are armed with pylons, so they get to throw this shock missile weapon even when charged. Ray and I had a very brief chat about what to do before the game, and frankly there was only really one option: attack everywhere as quickly as possible and hope to deal a fatal blow in the first turn. Ray took control of the Celtic warbands and the cavalry wing under Madrigal, while I led Hannibal and the heavy infantry at the head of the defile and to the left of our line. The opening move saw Ray lead his warbands screaming out of the woods and downhill towards the unsuspecting Romans. Unfortunately, this was only a partial success, with 1 Roman light infantry unit being forced into the lake and a watery grave. One of the other warbands was repulsed, and the 3rd failed to actually reach the Roman line, so that initial shock didn't quite come out how we wanted. The dice, however, did favour us, and I was able to activate Hannibal next and pushed my heavy spearmen into the defile and the lead elements of the Roman column. Poor Richard's dice completely abandoned him from this point on in the game, and my infantry hacked and slashed their way through the Roman velites with relative ease. Each successive pursuit took points from the Romans, and from that moment onwards they were hemorrhaging men and points at an ever increasing rate. We didn't have it all our own way, of course, and Steve, commanding Flaminius, was able to organise his legionaries into large units and move away from the shoreline. At one point, Flaminius was cutting his way through light infantry and then through the first of my Spanish scutari, but in the process his own troops were being depleted, and eventually my remaining scutari were able to send the Roman leader and his men all the way back to the lakeshore. The final blow came in the narrow defile at the head of the Roman column. My heavy infantry kept pressing forwards, and with each successive win and successive pursuit, the space available for escape was being reduced, and the points lost for the Romans grew and grew. Richard had clearly inherited the dice curse that I used to have, because his dice rolling completely abandoned him. I mean, he was rolling terrible, and I actually felt sorry for him. Doesn't often happen when your enemy is rolling so bad that you actually feel sorry for them. We had set aside 4 hours for this game, but it was over in about an hour and 45 minutes, and that included a bit of banter. The Carthaginians had inflicted a stunning defeat on the Romans that rivalled Hannibal's historic victory. Despite the drubbing, Richard and Steve were keen for a rematch, and so next week, tomorrow, this time we're going to switch sides, so Ray and I get to experience the Carthaginian ambush for ourselves. We're going to play the Romans. Let's hope we can get 2 victories out of this. Today, as this video goes out, I will be at the Cavalier Wargame show in Tunbridge in Kent. Now, this is usually the Reject's first show of the year. Although it's a small show, there's always some really good games on display and a handful of traders to spend your money with. And the bring and buy is usually very, very good, and I rarely leave without having spent some money. Of course, I'll be taking some photos and some video, and I'm going with a shopping list. So I'll be doing my best to get a video out of the show as quickly as I can, time permitting obviously. Now for a Workbench update. Despite saying I'd finished my 17th century warships for Mad for War, I have been tinkering with them instead of moving on to new projects. My ships needed to be named, and with a little help from Ray we came up with a set of names from actual vessels for this period. Ray also has a British fleet. He's decided to take the Red Squadron, and I've gone with the Blue Squadron, so I wanted to make sure that we didn't have the same names for our ships. So once we'd got them, I duly labelled all of my ships, and while I was at it I decided I was touching up the waves a little bit with a little bit of white dry brushing, just to add a little bit more detail to the sea bases. So although I said they were finished, I couldn't help myself, I had to do a little bit more tinkering. Now, as promised last week, I have started work on some of the 6mm buildings from Slug Industries, but I also need to paint my next entry for the Analog Hobbies Winter Painting Challenge. Now, the challenges are a set of optional bonus themes where participants can earn a few extra points over and above the value of the miniature itself. Now, I've been trying to work my entries to keep with the themes, and the next one that I wanted to do was Statue of a Famous Person. I had a rummage through my extensive lead mounting and found a really nice 28mm model of General Patton. It's a simple model, but painting the leather jacket took a little bit of care to get right. I'm reasonably happy with how it turned out, and of course that makes me 25 points closer to my overall target. It's going to be probably my lowest points target for the paint, any of the paint challenges I've taken part, but you know, I'm still chuffed with what I've managed to get done. I'm not pressing myself too much. I've got lots of other projects on the go. So with the Roman theme going on, I decided that it was time to do a book review. Now, I don't read as much as I used to, but there are some books that I've enjoyed so much that I find myself coming back to them time and again. So The Fall of Carthage by Adrian Goldsworthy is one such book. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, that you seek it out and give it a go. The book covers all 3 of the Punic Wars, showing how Carthage was utterly unprepared for the Roman way of making war. Even at the height of the Punic success, when Hannibal was ravaging the Italian countryside and destroying legion after legion, the Romans never wavered in their resolve to win or die. There was no middle ground for them. For them, this was a war that could only end in total destruction and subjugation of one side or the other. Such implacable stubbornness, frankly, was unthinkable in the Hellenistic world, and after 3 clear battlefield victories, Hannibal had every right to expect to conclude the war on terms favourable to Carthage. But this was not to be the case. Instead, the seeds of the complete destruction of Carthage over 60 years later were already being sown. The phrase, the sentence, "He who conquers is not the victor unless the loser considers himself beaten," was written by the writer Ennius, who actually penned his analysis during the time of the Roman Republic and the Punic Wars, but it perfectly sums up the Roman way of thinking. One of the best things about this book is that it is not overly academic. Goldsworthy does take his time to discuss the historical sources, and the book is meticulously referenced, and he never shies away from discussing those different sources' reliability, but it never really interferes with his telling of the historical story. Polybius is described as a generally reliable source and is one of the closest contemporaries of the history that he's actually writing about. Livy, writing later, is less reliable, and there is a suggestion that his approach is much more pro-Roman and therefore unreliable. But having said that, Goldsworthy does make it clear that sometimes the historians just have to work with whatever they've got. If they only have one source available, then that account has to be used, albeit with some caveats. Now, Goldsworthy concludes by describing the conflict with Carthage, and in particular the Second War, as Rome's Battle of Britain moment. Despite huge battlefield losses and a seemingly unstoppable foe, the Romans simply just refused to concede defeat. In so doing, they broke every convention of warfare in the ancient world and locked themselves into a life or death struggle that could only end in the utter annihilation of one side or the other. Carthage didn't see the war in such stark proportions and consequently didn't persecute the war as vigorously or as ruthlessly as they could have, and in so doing they lost the war and in the end everything. For me, the thing that makes this book stand out is the fact that all 3 Punic Wars are discussed in one volume, and that the links between each conflict are very clearly laid out, and I've not seen that before in any of the other books that I have particularly read about this particular period. In effect, the author is arguing that the 3 wars that spanned over a century were effectively a single struggle with Rome, growing stronger economically, politically and militarily with every encounter. The Roman mindset was not initially expansionist, but the conflict with Carthage changed that outlook, partly as a necessity of the war with such a deadly foe, and in the end of the period Rome was on the fast track to becoming the world's first superpower, but arguably only because of Carthage. This is a very enjoyable book to read, and one of the best pieces of historical analysis that I've come across for this period of history. For both these reasons, I highly recommend it. So that's it for this week. Please join in the conversation in the comments below. As always, I really do enjoy reading them. And if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share. And if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from this channel, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.